is Jason JROCK Houston, and you're listening to Chaotic Riffs Magazine. We can be found on the web at www.chaoticriffs.com. And once again, our special guest this week is Gar Borras, the lead singer from the Los Angeles-based Guns N' Roses tribute band, Appetite for Destruction. Last week we were talking with you about Alice Cooper's $1 Billion Babies album, and we had so much fun with you last week. Gar, we want to talk to you about another album that really influenced you this week for our On the Record segment. And this week we'll be talking about Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. Both albums are very, very different. We're talking from Alice Cooper to Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, and I thought that would be kind of fun to kind of go from one spectrum of the music world to another, and Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon very, very different. So let's talk about how you first heard the album and became a fan.
Well, way back when I was a kid, back in the 70s, I was always interested in music that was, pushing the envelope. And I remember, I would look at like music magazines. I don't know, I'm not saying that I saw it in Hit Parade, but, as an example, Circus Magazine, Hit Parade. I'm not sure what magazine that I was reading.
Yeah.
But they had articles about Pink Floyd, and you could see pictures of their show, and they had this big screen behind the band, and so it was different than just a band playing. It was a whole production going on.
Yeah.
Where they would be playing music, but there would also be really cool stuff going on the screen behind the band, and it kind of got my attention. And then their stuff started getting played on the radio, and it was I think like maybe about 72, 73, something like that. You would hear there's Dark Side of the Moon on the radio, and it was just really it was music that wasn't reliant on how fast you played.
Oh, definitely.
Or how super complicated it was. It was just, there was a lot of deep thought.
Yeah, deep. Pink Floyd, especially back in the day, they were really what you would call thinking man's music. Like you said, it was nothing like that out there really at the time. And you made an interesting point. Back at that time, see, this album was released March 1st, 1973, just to kind of give people a time frame of when we're talking here. And oddly enough, you made a great point about back in the days, like you, Gar. I grew up with all those great rock magazines back in the day, Circus Magazine and Hit Parade, and even Rolling Stone back in the day to somewhat of a degree. People fail to realize back then we did not have the internet, so a lot of times you'd pick up those magazines and you'd find out about Queen or Kiss are coming to your town, or Pink Floyd, and this is what the show is going to be like, but they didn't necessarily know. You didn't necessarily know when they came to your town what the set list was yet, and stuff like that. So that those rock magazines and stuff, a lot of that would really influence what you were going to buy. Like you pick up the magazine, you see, oh, these are the popular bands, or these are the bands that are out on tour now. Oh, I'm going to go and get this album,
It really affected you. You would see the pictures, and you would read the articles. And back in those days, when bands would come out with albums, you would wait in anticipation. Oh my gosh, I can't wait until they come out with the
or like even you see
album.
You see the advertisement maybe like in Circus Magazine for Dark Side of the Moon. Okay, that's what the album cover looks like, or okay, I'm gonna go get that album, or okay, so that's the single that's out right now, or that's the song I heard on the radio, and one thing like a band like Kiss that really image conscious, and they were all over the place. But a band even more to the point like Pink Floyd, like when Dark Side of the Moon comes out and they start, like, the album becomes a hit, you're starting to see those guys more and more in the rock magazines back in the day, where they weren't necessarily one of those critic darling bands, but because the music got to be so popular, you started to see, oh, so that's what David Gilmour looks like. That's what Roger Waters looked like.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and then when the albums would come out, oh my gosh, you would just put the record on and listen to it from beginning to end, and read every single piece of anything to read on the album.
Yeah. Yeah.
You would even read the sleeve that would go around the record. You would just basically, just read the whole thing as you're listening to the album.
And again, Gar, we're talking about a time where, like we were talking last week, back at this time, like all the bands would release a single. You go get all the singles on a 45, and you look at they really, back in the day, this is a single, and you could go. I remember when you go on Tower Records, and they had a whole section of just where you could pick up all the 45s, and then they'd usually have an alternative, like a B-side track on the other side.
Some of those B-sides were amazing, stuff too.
Yeah, like Def Leppard's one of the bands that was famous for that. You'd get all these, like, they'd have the single out, like something like maybe even Pour Some Sugar on Me. You turn it over, and it had like a rare track they never released, on an album before. So just a little something extra to give the fans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they were known as kind of the when the band first started. See, I didn't realize, there was a whole history of the band before Dark Side of the Moon.
Interesting, yeah. And if you go back and you look at that,
their whole history was a psychedelic band.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's almost like they got kind of the three eras of Pink Floyd. They got kind of that older stuff, like you said. It's kind of like just sounds nothing like what Pink Floyd became, and you got Dark Side of the Moon and stuff that came later on, more commercial. It's not fair to say Dark Side of the Moon's very commercial sounding, but it's when the band started to get their popularity, if you know what I mean.
Well, to me, because, after Dark Side of the Moon, of course, I started going to the record stores and I started checking out their previous stuff, like Umaguma. I wound up buying that. And, there was a bunch of other stuff, that, all this material that was during their Syd Barrett period, when Syd Barrett was the big star of the band.
Not David Gilmour or Roger Waters, those guys.
And it was kind of crazy learning about all of that stuff, because when you listen to that music that was previous to Dark Side of the Moon, it was really strange stuff.
Oh yeah, and see, that's the thing. Probably when people think of Pink Floyd, probably the two albums that come to mind right away is this album, Dark Side of the Moon, and then The Wall. And they got some comparisons because they're like, I would say The Wall is a little more commercial, a little more radio friendly, whereas the Dark Side of the Moon's kind of really got a sound of its own. But they're both like concept albums and stuff. And Roger Waters was kind of a man that kind of took over, so to speak, when it came to The Wall and that. But both very interesting albums. And The Dark Side of the Moon, it almost sounds, if you listen to it like for the first time, with just hearing for the first time, let's say, you kind of stop and wonder, what were these guys smoking? This sounds like very trippy stuff. And yet at the same time, people refer to it as progressive rock. And at the same time, it's vastly different than anything you've ever heard before or since.
Well, it was progressive rock. I would consider myself in my younger years during that time. I was a big fan of anything that pushed the envelope.
Yeah.
And progressive rock was, mostly the stuff that pushed the envelope. But Dark Side of the Moon, when Pink Floyd started doing stuff like that, they were pushing the envelope in a different way.
Yeah. Just kind of to see if they could be different.
It was really kind of, they matured from a psychedelic band into a band that had a lot of concepts in the songs.
Yeah.
The songs were about, obviously they were about things that were deep to them, and most of the writing was by Roger Waters.
Yeah.
So most of that stuff had to do with deep things experiences that Roger and David Gilmour, experienced and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So there was, those songs were telling stories, and a lot of the songs on Dark Side of the Moon were telling stories about Syd Barrett.
Interesting.
They were kind of homages to Syd Barrett about how he had lost his mind.
Yeah.
He I guess in the easiest way to put it, he went insane.
Yeah, he literally had a breakdown from what I understand, and that's like you said, the two different kind of Pink Floyds. There's almost two different worlds, miles apart, and yet, so I think this classic album we're talking about that's had such a huge impact and influence on people, for all these years. They're kind of writing, like you said, a lot about their former frontman, and obviously, think about the influence he's had on those guys, because not only were they writing songs about what they seen their friend and their former bandmate go through, but he obviously had a huge impact on those guys to write stuff like this that was influenced by him or kind of his story.
Well, even David Gilmour used to before Pink Floyd and before all of that stuff, David Gilmour used to actually jam. Doing like guitars and harmonica stuff on college campuses, with him and Syd Barrett.
Oh, wow.
So there was a history. Everybody kind of knows David Gilmour as the guy that replaced Syd Barrett.
Yeah.
But there was a lot more ties between David Gilmour and Syd Barrett. They were actual close friends and used to play music together before Pink Floyd.
Wow. Yeah, and just to kind of give people an idea the huge impact this album's had on, the musical landscape all these years. I mean, I was reading that, it's been like, it's been certified 11 times platinum. I guess they did that on June 4th, 1998. And the interesting thing about that is, I guess initially it had spent like something like 741 weeks on the chart, and just to kind of give you an idea, that was like it actually remained on the charts from 1973 when it was first released all the way through 1988, and then it eventually in 1988 fell off the charts, and then it only kind of reemerged again a couple years later in 1991 when they introduced this thing called the Top Pop Album chart. So I mean, again, just not many albums you can really think of it from the time it's been released almost 20 years later, it's still on the charts.
Well, that's what, a lot of, that's why you call it art.
Yeah.
A lot of people, look at musicians and stuff like that, and but no, anything that has staying power like that is art.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really is. And it's art in the sense, like you said, it's not what your typical rock music would sound like, but it definitely has influenced people. It's definitely has an appeal to people for something to remain on the charts that long,
Yeah. And I just remember, being a kid, and I would put on, Dark Side of the Moon, and I would basically play Roger Waters' bass parts. all the way through the album. In fact, back when I was in high school, I guess when I was maybe like a junior/senior in high school, I used to have friends that would come over, and I would put on records, and I would memorize all of the bass lines, and basically it was a miniature concert at my house.
Wow.
Where I would put on the album, and then I would plug my bass in, and then I would just play along with the album.
Wow.
From beginning to end. And I used to do that with a lot of records. I used to do that with Dark Side of the Moon. I used to do that with Thick as a Brick by Jethro Tull.
Wow.
Think about it, because, I was so into progressive stuff at that time. Thick as a Brick by Jethro Tull was, the entire album was one song.
Wow.
And none of it repeated.
Wow.
So it was one song which was not a repetitious thing, and I would memorize the bass lines and play the entire album all the way through.
Wow. I'm gonna have to check that out. I'm not a huge Jethro Tull fan, but I got an appreciation for stuff like that. And obviously, like I can see on your list that you made on your Facebook page there, but you got quite a bit of a progressive influence there. I see also included like Yes, so that's pretty cool to kind of think,
I would put on Fragile by Yes.
Yeah.
And my friends would kick back at my house with the bong, watching me play, Fragile all the way through. I had all of Chris Squire's bass lines memorized, including The Fish, which is, it's basically some of Chris Squire's really, really complicated stuff that was really dominated by the bass.
Yeah.
And I would play the entire album all the way through. And so my friends, because back in the 70s, high school kids would be smoking weed, and coming over to my house, and we, and I would just put on these albums, and they would just kick back and listen to me play, note for note, all of this stuff all the way through. And I had quite a number of friends that used to come over and do that, hang out with me.
I guess that kind of makes sense. You grew up on a lot of this progressive rock stuff, and then, by the time the 80s rock scene hits and you start trying to take a crack at, having a professional music career of your own, eventually end up doing what you're doing with Appetite for Destruction, kind of, you would think, okay, he grew up on all of this progressive rock stuff, and he's paying tribute now to Axl Rose, which is kind of the other end of the spectrum, but it kind of makes sense if you think about it, because Axl Rose is, he's hard rock, he's the angst, he's a little bit of everything, because even Axl was influenced by everybody, from Alice Cooper to the Beatles.
Well, he's pretty close to my age too, so
yeah.
he was being influenced by the same stuff that I was being influenced by.
Yeah, and Dark Side of the Moon, getting back to that for a minute, the other thing that's kind of interesting about that is very much like what Queen did with the song Bohemian Rhapsody. Back in the day, they would tell these bands, no, you can't have a 9 or 10 minute song, but like very much like what Queen did there, they kind of we're going to do it our way. We're going to do what we want. Probably I would imagine when they first the Pink Floyd guys first went into their record company and they played them Dark Side of the Moon, and probably, what is this? What is this? This sounds like nothing we've heard before. But it was such a hit with the fans. People took to it immediately. I think that's the thing people dig about it so much. It was so kind of against the norm at the time. It was kind of the very thing you weren't expecting.
Well, back in those days, if a band wanted to be successful touring and selling records, the bar was extremely high.
Yeah.
So if you were going to compete with these other bands like the Pink Floyds, the Queens, and Jethro Tull was another big one back in those days. And there's if you look at that whole list of all those albums that I put that were an influence on me, I think if not 90%, 100% of it is all from the 70s.
Yeah, well, it makes sense. Like you said, that's the time you grew up around, and that's what was coming out at the time.
That's like my developing years where I was, using the music of others to, wow, if I could learn, I was always looking for very challenging pieces of music to learn how to play, because my mentality was, if I could learn how to play this, then I would be good enough to be able to play in a band, or I would be good enough to perform in front of an audience. And so if you wanted to play with other musicians, you couldn't play with other musicians if you only knew how to play just a piece of the song. You would have to be able to learn from the very beginning all the way to the end of the song. And I didn't know it because at the time I was just trying to take on pieces of music, because I don't know if I'm I'm a singer nowadays, but back in those days, my complete focus was bass.
Wow.
That was my thing. If I could learn how to play this piece of music, I would be good enough to do, to play in a band, or I would be good enough to move to the next step.
Level. And it's kind of interesting talking a little bit about the tribute scene that you're a part of. That's why I think a band like Pink Floyd, while there's obviously a couple of the tributes out there, such as Which One's Pink, and I think there's another one around LA area, but there's not a whole lot of them, because Pink Floyd's music, again, is so, I want to say, complex, or so very different from your typical band, like even a band like The Who or AC/DC. That's why there's not, a million Pink Floyd tributes, I think, because in addition to the music and the sound, they got the lasers and the light show, and that makes it, they really do put on the ultimate rock show. So paying tribute to a band like that, I think, is a lot of hard work.
Well, during my favorite time, the three records that they put out that were the closest to me was, of course, Dark Side of the Moon, and then Wish You Were Here, which was the very next album that they put out after Dark Side of the Moon. And then the very next album that they put after that was Animals. To me, that's my favorite. When they came out with The Wall, The Wall, for me, was kind of a departure from what they had been doing previously. With, Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and Animals. It was very obvious that The Wall was, so much more of a concept thing, where it was almost like, of course, it became a movie. Yeah,
that's what I was going to say. It's interesting because you put on like the Wall album, and it is like one thing. Like you can't really go bad with any of those songs. It's a great produced album, great songs. But where I kind of get tripped out on is watching that movie. It's like, okay, what is this even about? So kind of different and confusing at the same time. Like you say, well, it's art, it's subjective, but they really became at that point, I think in 1980 after The Wall, really thinking man's music,
Well, it was really dominated by Roger Waters by then. All of the music that was going on during Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and Animals was more of a collaborative thing, where there was more involvement by David Gilmour, and there was more involvement by Wright. You know what I mean? And, so you know what I mean. So that's I kind of started waning when they were doing The Wall, because it just seemed to be I don't know. I really enjoyed those three albums, and I actually got to see back in I have a story to tell you.
Okay, let's hear it.
Back in 1975. Me and my pot-smoking friends went to see Pink Floyd in concert.
Oh, wow.
And they played at the LA Sports Arena.
Wow.
And the police chief, his name was Ed Davis.
Okay.
I remember him because it was kind of a traumatic experience. The police chief of Los Angeles, Ed Davis, went on TV before Pink Floyd, because I think they did 3 dates.
Okay.
He made an announcement on the news or whatever, press conference and all that stuff, that that they were going to be there because they knew what Pink Floyd was all about.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They were all about, smoking weed, psychedelics, and all of that stuff. And so I didn't really think anything of it, but me and my friends, we were just like huge Pink Floyd fans, and we were all excited, because we stood in line to buy tickets and everything like that. And so we hopped in the car, and we're driving out there, and we're just getting kind of close to the sports arena where they were playing, and of course, one of the guys had a joint lit, and we were smoking it, and all of a sudden we got close to the sports arena, and there was cops everywhere.
Wow.
It was just, immediately we went from, just excited and anticipation and, oh boy, Pink Floyd, to being scared.
Wow.
So immediately everybody, we threw the joint out the window, and so, we went and parked the car and everything, and we walked and we got in line to go inside the venue, and there was this big line, and the line was moving really slow.
Wow.
And so, we're just waiting, and next thing you know, we get up, as you're getting closer, you could see there's this policeman, and he was gigantic. He had to be at least 6'5", and he was very, very intimidating. And he was looking at every single person in the eye before you went into the venue. And if he determined that you were like, on something, or intoxicated in any way, you were arrested right there on the spot.
Wow.
And, later on, we went in, and it took there was this big, huge delay before Pink Floyd took the stage, and then finally they came out, and then they talked to the audience. The band's talking to the audience before they even played, expressing their dismay at, I think we were there for the first night. 300 people got arrested that night.
Oh, wow, amazing.
And so the band was really, really upset about that. And so, so they went into their set, and the first half of because what Pink Floyd used to do back in those days when they did a concert was they would do a first half of concert, and there was no opening bands like the way they do it nowadays. It was just Pink Floyd.
Wow, okay.
So they would do a first half of the concert, and then they would take an intermission.
Wow.
And then everybody would leave their seats, and then you could go buy sodas. You could I guess if you're over 21, you could buy beers, and then they would have the T-shirts, and you could go to the concession stands. And then, after the intermission, then you would go back to your seat, and then you would see the second half of the concert.
Oh, wow, okay.
Well, the first half of the concert, they had just came out with "Wish You Were Here."
Oh, wow.
And so that was the first half of the concert, and I hadn't had a chance to hear Wish You Were Here. So I actually got to hear Wish You Were Here performed live, and that's how I got to hear it.
Oh wow, that's a great story. And
so that was the first half of the concert, and then we took the intermission, and we checked out the T-shirts, and got something to drink, or whatever we did during intermission, and then we came back to our seats, and then the second half of the concert was Dark Side of the Moon.
Oh wow!
Can you imagine that?
I really can. What an amazing, and like I would say, I was also reading up on Dark Side of the Moon that it was a loosely based concept album, and a lot of the songs and stuff were based around obviously like corporate greed and money and stuff. And it's kind of funny because that's when Pink Floyd actually started really making some big money at that time. And I gotta tell you, one of my favorite all-time Pink Floyd songs just happened to be on this album. It's Money. I also like Time, and then there's a song called Brain Damage, which is, again, it's kind of interesting. If you listen to the song Brain Damage, it's actually got the lyrics Dark Side of the Moon, and I'm kind of thinking, okay, why didn't they just call this Dark Side of the Moon? But I guess they want to kind of really make people think what the song's about, actually,
Well, and there, some of it is referencing back to Syd Barrett, because the reason why Syd Barrett, a lot of people, I don't know if a lot of people know, but Syd Barrett, when he was unraveling, he was literally eating LSD like candy.
Yeah, I mean, after he left Pink Floyd, he really kind of just disappeared, and I think he just recently passed away sometime in the 2000s, but he never really got any better. He just kind of, somebody, I guess, looked after him up until time he died, and again, that was just fairly recently, but never had any kind of really solo career, did anything after Pink Floyd. That was his 15 minutes of fame, if you will.
Well, I would imagine if you're eating LSD like candy, there's got to be some brain damage going on.
Yeah.
So that might have something to do with their choice to calling that piece Brain Damage. You know what I mean?
And again, what I kind of like about the songs on this album is they're not necessarily just like 3 or 4 minute tracks. The music's a little more deeper than that,
Well, but they could get away with doing that back in the same. That's why they called it AOR, album-oriented rock.
Yeah.
Because a lot of pieces that were being done during the 70s that became popular were much longer than your 3-minute ditties, which is what mostly was going on previous to that.
Yeah, and I mean, just think when you would go see as you could probably attest to this, when you would go see a band like Pink Floyd, just think what the set list would be like. Like you said, it'd be so vastly different. You got everything from Wish You Were Here to The Wall and Dark Side of the Moon. I mean, and because the pieces are so long, it's like, how do we pace? It must be an interesting thing to kind of, how do we decide which songs we're going to play?
Well, it was, when you watched them in concert, it was like listening to the album from the very beginning all the way through the end.
Now, I got to ask, when you saw them on that tour, besides the amazing songs and music and stuff, what was, because I've heard Pink Floyd puts on one of the greatest live shows.
Are you there?
Yeah. I was asking. What's it like? Like Pink Floyd, they got great songs but I hear they put on a great live show, with the lasers and everything. Did you get to see that when you saw?
Well, back in '75, they hadn't progressed to using, I guess those big giant puppets and stuff that they were doing. They did that. They started doing that. The beginnings of doing that was when they started doing arena stuff, which is when they came out with Animals.
Yeah.
And so Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here was the way the band originally was, which was the band would be playing and then they would have the giant screen behind. And when I saw them, the screen behind the band would be kind of helping you to understand the stories behind the song, because what was going on the screens were in relation to what they were talking about in the songs.
Yeah, and that's why it's interesting that even today, all these years later, like The Wall, it was Roger Waters' kind of baby to begin with, but he really has kind of made it his own. I mean, the last couple of solo tours he's done, he centered his tour around that, and like you said, it's become a big thing with, like, he has different images on the video screen, so it really has taken a life of its own, you know?
I was really disappointed that I never did get a chance to see Pink Floyd again when they did the Animals, because that basically was they were talking about different classifications, societal classifications of different types of people. One classified as pigs, another classified as dogs, and another classified as sheep.
Oh yeah, interesting.
And what I heard that they did when they were playing Animals live is they when they were playing the songs, they would have, when they were playing Pigs, they would have a giant pig.
Oh wow.
And they would be doing these stadium shows, so it would be like this giant pig floating in the air, or they would have a giant sheep floating in the air. And it just seemed like kind of a really cool twist to seeing a live show in doing that. And I know that they also did that when they were doing The Wall, but instead of it being pigs and sheep, it was those weird character drawings that you saw, like the teacher, and stuff like that. Those were the big, things that, were kind of, floating around as you would be, watching them perform. But I just heard about it, so I could only visualize what it looked like.
Yeah.
But, I just heard it from friends that, oh my gosh, they did this, oh my gosh, they did that, and it was so cool. So I was really disappointed that I didn't get to see them do Animals. But that's another album that I used to put on, and I would play it all the way from beginning to the end, and my friends would, come over and, and watch me play this all the way through.
And so, like, let me ask you, what was it about that Animals album that just kind of really, knocked you out of your seat? Was it because it was just so different from what had come before?
It was very, the whole approach to how they were doing it was very still similar to what they were doing with Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here. When you could listen to it, you have to understand it. If you listen to Animals, if especially like as a music fan, sitting in somebody's car smoking a joint and listening to it on a stereo radio system in a car, that was some really stony stuff they were doing.
Yeah. Wow.
And you would listen to it and you would hear, like, there would be things that they would be doing sound-wise, sonic-wise in the songs that were really kind of, I guess the best way to put it, very stony, because if you're smoking weed and you're listening to this, the same kind of experience when you were listening to Wish You Were Here.
Wow.
They would use sounds that, it's where if you're high when you're listening to it, it was really trippy to listen to. But other bands were doing that stuff too.
Yeah.
But it just seemed that Pink Floyd was the people that, or the band that really took it to an art form.
Yeah, it's funny you say art form, because I'll tell you, where I grew up, like in Long Beach, California, back in the day, I remember like they had a local theater here, and on the weekend they'd alternate between as far as movies, Pink Floyd's The Wall, and then the Rocky Horror Picture Show. I remember a lot of these kids back in the day who just discovering these movies for the first time, and they had nothing better to do. They'd go hang out with their friends. It was like a real major weekend event. And
they had that in West Covina where I grew up too. There's a theater that was in West Covina called the Capri Theater that's no longer there. It's all different over there. But yeah, it was like kind of like going to a rock concert, but you would be going to see movies, and they would play movies like "Song Remains the Same" by Led Zeppelin.
Even cool.
Or they would play concert footage of Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah, and as far as The Wall, I think like if you compare The Wall and Dark Side of the Moon, I think what makes it so drastically different is if you listen to Dark Side of the Moon, that's kind of when the friction among the band members was starting. The band was kind of starting to fall apart, but at the same time they were still kind of in the studio working together. By the time The Wall came around, Roger Waters was trying to take control of the band, and then
he had totally taken over the band. And what I heard is when different members would do their tracks, they would go in, without the other people, just listen to it and then just add what they were going to add to it. They were becoming so separate and so divided by that time because, from what I heard is Roger by that time was kind of holding other members down.
Yeah, and that's why I think they did not really tour again until 1987. It wasn't, Roger, I think, had left by 1985. The rest of the band wasn't really sure what they were going to do. But see, that's by the time 1987 rolled around, they, Gilmour decided, well, I think we'll give Pink Floyd another try. We can do it without Roger. And much to his credit, they were able to do that for a while. And that
there's plenty of people, it's very, very different from what they were doing, but still very good because David Gilmour is one of those incredible guitarists that never relied on speed in what he was doing. It was almost, what I read in articles, that he would sing a lot of his leads and then actually transfer it to the guitar.
I think most people for years thought of him, because he was a frontman primarily as a singer, but as time went on, people also started to appreciate him for his guitar playing. The interesting thing, too, if you go back to 1980 when they released The Wall, see, again, Dark Side of the Moon, they were actually still in the studio working together. Roger Waters was very involved in the production by the time, but Wall came, though, they brought in this guy, Bob Ezrin, who was, at the time, very well known for producing those early Alice Cooper albums, and he produced Kiss's Destroyer album. If you listen to The Wall and Destroyer, for example, a lot of it, you can hear a lot of Bob Ezrin's production that he was known for these little like sound effects. Like if you listen to Detroit Rock City on Destroyer, you hear like Paul Stanley or somebody talking at the beginning of the song, and then there's like a news report on the radio. That was what this guy Ezrin was known for, just putting in these tiny little sound effects, and people would focus on the little sound effects, and that's what made The Wall kind of just such an incredible production. They had all these different little sound effects that you might not necessarily hear, but if you listen close enough, you could hear every little sound, Well,
they actually started doing the sound effects things during Dark Side of the Moon, too.
Yeah.
That actually was kind of, an Alan Parsons thing that he kind of brought to Pink Floyd, and then Alan Parsons started becoming successful with the Alan Parsons Project, and so he separated from Pink Floyd, and then that's when they started going to Ezrin and started doing his style, Ezrin's style.
And it's interesting. I don't know too much about Alan Parsons. I've heard of him obviously, in Alan Parsons Project, but he had his own successful career. And what I was reading, like you said, back when Dark Side first came out, a lot of people were giving him, the credit for album success. And from what I understand, neither Gilmour or Roger Waters really were too happy with that. And that's part of the reason, like you said, they went their separate ways after that.
Yeah, and he was it's kind of a production thing, adding these different sound effects and stuff like that. But when you hear money, you hear the
the cash register, it's like, wow.
Yeah, and all of those sound effects, that was Alan Parsons' input, or the clocks at the beginning of time.
Yeah.
That was Alan Parsons, as being part of that. So, I actually had gone out and bought the Alan Parsons Project, and it was actually pretty good. And you could hear the similarities behind what Alan Parsons was doing when he came out with Alan Parsons Project and Dark Side of the Moon. You can hear a lot of similarities in the two. And it was kind of interesting because his stories were kind of Edgar Allan Poe-ish.
Yeah, wow.
There was that kind of a theme to when he came out with his first. It was called Alan Parsons Project. But then after that, the only one that I really cared for was the first one that was called Alan Parsons Project. But the stuff that he did after that was just kind of a rehash of it and everything. It just didn't have that much originality to it.
And see, that's the thing is again, I'm not really aware of Alan Parsons. I've heard the name, but I think that's why, like you said, maybe that he only had that one little bit of, that like you said, you only cared for that one album. I think part of the reason, people might initially check the guy out because he's got the Pink Floyd, so let's hear what this guy's about. But then they start to compare, okay, is this really like Pink Floyd or not?
And I did, that's exactly the reason why I checked it out, is because, he did have a strong credit, and he did gain notoriety for that and everything like that. And of course you got to go check it out and everything. And it did sell well and everything like that. But it was kind of like a one, instead of a one-hit wonder, as a one album thing. And then after that, I just kind of lost focus. It kind of dropped off the radar for me.
Yeah, well even these days, unfortunately, you don't hear the name Alan Parsons all that much, unless you're referring to Pink Floyd or, those classic albums that he put out at the time. But again, 40 years later, we're talking about Pink Floyd, not Alan Parsons, if you know what I mean.
Exactly. Yeah. So, man, I just, during that whole time, the two bands through the 70s when I was, kind of getting, spreading my wings and kind of building my abilities as a musician or my abilities as a bass player. Back in those days, the two biggest influences on me were Pink Floyd and another band called Yes.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Those are, if there's any two bands that, all of the other bands that I listed on my Facebook were all heavy influences on me. I used all of those bands to stretch my abilities as a bass. If I could learn how to do this, then I could move to the next level. If I could learn how to do that, I could move to the next level. And of course, you're always trying to find stuff that was really, really difficult to do because, if you're wanting to go to the next level and you're wanting to be able to try, I want to take a stab at what, these bands that are putting this music out, if I'm going to play music that's going to stand up to them, I got to be able to learn how to play their music.
Oh, of course. And it's kind of interesting. You mentioned Pink Floyd, and yes, and I think the thing with Pink Floyd, like if Roger Waters was more willing to kind of join Gilmour and get the band back together. I think they could. They have the power. I think they'd have the power to still go out there and do it. But it's kind of reached its peak because Roger Waters, he's done some one-off shows with Gilmour, but never really had the desire to go back to the band. And I think Gilmour's kind of, taken as far as he even realized as far as he can take it at this point.
Well, Gilmour was, just an incredible guitarist, but a lot of people don't know that he is one of the most creative person with pedals.
Yeah.
He was the guy that could take pedals and push those pedals to the maximum of what you can get out of those pedals to come out with beautiful creative sounds.
Yeah.
And I just remember when I saw them in concert, that Dark Side of the Moon back in 1975 when I saw them in concert. I remember one of the most profound parts of that concert was when they played the first, because on Wish You Were Here there's two Shine On You Crazy Diamonds.
Yeah.
The opening Shine On You Crazy Diamond, where he just plays 3 notes. Just 3 notes. That's it. And it was so spacious and it was so powerful. And he wasn't ripping and doing all that. He was just playing 3 notes. And I just remember that being so powerful with such simplicity. You know what I mean? Because it was do-do-do-do.
Well, yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. And
those 3 notes.
Yeah.
Do-do-do-do.
Oh, yeah, just so powerful.
And listening to them when he played it, the perfection in sound inside of a large arena. It was very breathtaking, and it's really hard for me to describe because most musicians, grade on how complicated it was or how fast it was, or you know what I mean? All of these different things. But it was just 3 simple notes, but yet I cannot express enough listening to them play that live how powerful it was.
Yeah, and I think that's why when Gilmour decided to kind of fold Pink Floyd up and kind of call it a day and concentrate on his solo career, I think that's why fans were willing to allow him to kind of do the solo thing, because he didn't have that expectation of David Gilmour still going out there and doing Pink Floyd, and that's why if you listen to his solo work, it's so drastically different than Pink Floyd. But I think he's allowed that freedom kind of do that. Okay, you've done the Pink Floyd thing all these years. Okay, you want to do this? It's cool.
Yeah, I can't say enough about him as a guitarist. There's so many times that I would listen to Dark Side of the Moon, and I would literally sing along with his guitar solos.
Yeah. And what amazes me about Gilmour as a vocalist and a frontman is he's not one of Pink Floyd. They were huge. They were big back in the day, and we're still talking about them. But the thing about a guy like Gilmour, he was not a flamboyant frontman, yet he was able to kind of, wow the crowd, if you will. He wasn't over the top or anything, but even with some of the Pink Floyd's more trippier music, I mean, he was able to just take command of the stage. It just amazes me,
Yeah, just perfection in sound.
Yeah, that's perfection and light and sound. And interesting enough, I was reading, I don't know too much about this, but maybe you do. I was reading something today about the artwork for Dark Side of the Moon. Originally, it came out back in the day when vinyl was big, and they, if you kind of look at the artwork, it's kind of like, what is this? It's kind of a funny looking picture. But I was reading, it had to do with something like 3 of the elements, like live sound. It had some of the lyrics. But if you look, it's this funny looking kind of weird shaped thing, and the shape went all through vinyl album cover, and people are kind of tripping out trying to figure out what it is. But there were all these different meanings to what it is. Like it had to do with color, sight, and sound. And I guess people could go and read up on that. But it's kind of like it just makes you think. Because usually, like you look at a picture on an album cover, oh, okay, that's what this is, But it really started making people think, what is this? And I was kind of tripping out when I was reading up about it. It had to do with color, sight, and sound. Oh, okay, I could see that maybe.
Well, another thing that I had heard is what it stood for was societal. A singular, which is the single beam going into the prism.
Okay, yeah, okay.
And then coming out divided into many different colors, which was kind of a societal statement.
Oh, wow, okay. Really making us think there, but okay, I see that now.
Yeah, so that was another, that I had actually heard too. So there, who knows? It would just be a tremendous, I would be absolutely floored to be able to just sit down and maybe talk to them.
Oh, yeah.
And, get their take on it.
Yeah. And
because that would be just the best to just get it straight from the horse's mouth.
Yeah.
What was really, some of these backstories behind the thinking and, because they were always such deep in thought, with their lyrics and their sounds and everything. I would just love to be able to get, more, of a backstory type of information from them.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, just in my own following of Pink Floyd over years, I think if, we had Roger Waters right in front of us right now and you were to ask him, I think he'd probably tell you something to the effect of like, well, why do you want me to tell you what it's about? What do you think it's about? You have to have me.
You just hit the head of the nail, because that's what art is. It's not what the artist thinks. When you're creating art, you're creating each individual person to become exposed to your art, to come up with their own interpretation of what they're saying. That is the head of the nail of what art stands for. Whether it's a painting, any form of art.
Yeah.
It's really, to the artist, it's more important in them being able to provoke thought in the person being exposed to their art as to what they personally think.
Yeah, I mean, it's like talking about Dark Side of the Moon like we've been doing today, and you stop and think, okay, well, first experience any of us ever had was putting the album on, hearing the songs, and then like in your case, maybe next experience you got to go see a live show, and that kind of takes it to the next level, as you say, and then you're like, okay, I want to see what these guys are going to come up with on the next album, and even something like The Wall we've been talking a little bit about, you put on the album and it's one experience, and then you kind of trip out on the movie and like, okay, man, they've taken it totally to different, but man, what an experience. I don't even know what I just watched, but I'm going to try to figure it out.
Well, what I heard is that it has to do with young life experiences that Roger Waters went through way back, because he was young.
Yeah.
When England was being bombed by the Germans.
And we're talking about guys that are like, the early to mid 70s. So they've experienced all of this, and we're kind of looking back on the art they created.
Yeah. So who knows? But it would be so interesting to be able to, at least get some kind of a glimpse as to what was going through the mind of the actual artist, coming up. Yeah. Like I said, my three favorite are Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and Pink, the Animals. But still, it doesn't mean that I don't appreciate The Wall.
Yeah, it kind of, like you said, it makes you kind of, what you sit here and you think, like saying, initially you listen and you're like, man, this is pretty trippy stuff. I wonder what they're on. But just think about that for a minute. Maybe they weren't even on anything. Maybe they were. Who knows? But they've influenced a generation of people. And let's just think about that for a minute. If they weren't smoking anything. They weren't doing any dope. They created some pretty great music in the end. When all is said and done.
Well, we did. I do know that they were dabbling in stuff during the psychedelic time.
Yeah.
The pre Dark Side of the Moon stuff. There was that the music that was coming out of them at that time. Oh my gosh, there had to be dabblings.
Had to be
in
other
different
influences
things
coming through. But and I will say this: it's kind of interesting, Gar, to find out you were also so heavily influenced by. Yes, I have an appreciation for what I'm not a huge Yes fan, but I will say this: of the bands you're talking about, Pink Floyd and Yes, these are two bands that they had very long. Yes is even to this day still putting out music and touring. So you got to have an appreciation for what they did and what they continue to do. And I was just kind of curious as a Yes fan. There was a brief period when some of the members were like Anderson, Roofman, and Wakeman, and they were calling it something else. Did you still follow them when they weren't calling it Yes?
Well, I had my favorite time period, just like I did with Pink Floyd. I had my favorite time period with Yes, and it was the same kind of experience where it started. My favorite was Fragile, and then Close to the Edge. Stuff like that. Because those two albums really encompassed what the band when they were at the height of their creativity. What was about them that attracted me was so much different than Pink Floyd, because what it was the musicianship,
the bass.
Every single member of the band, Yes, was a virtuoso. Steve Howe was a virtuoso guitarist. Rick Wakeman was a virtuoso piano player. Chris Squire was a virtuoso bass player. Alan White was a virtuoso drummer. They were all virtuosos in their own right. And the music that they used to come up with was extremely complicated. And which is very, very different from what a lot of the other bands that were putting out. Because at the same time, when I was in high school, I was kind of where everybody else in high school, it was all Led Zeppelin, and I appreciated Led Zeppelin. The musicianship in that band was incredible, and the song craftsmanship that they had to be able to craft those songs and come up with that stuff was incredible. But while everybody else was into Led Zeppelin, I was into Yes. I was one of those guys that had to, I'm not going to go with, whatever, the big popularity, thing. I'm going to go with what my own individuality, that kind of a thing.
I'm with you, yeah.
So, but Yes was extremely melodic. Their music had a lot of melody in it. But the way that the different instruments intertwined was like a tapestry. Nobody was playing the same thing. It was all 5 or 6 completely different parts, but you put all those parts together, and it was, I guess the best way to put it, it was much more orchestral rock.
There you go. That's a perfect way to put it. And kind of like you, I always had appreciation for Led Zeppelin, love what they did, but like I think I was sharing with you last week, I always, as far as those British bands, I always lean more towards Deep Purple, just because they're a little bit heavier for the most part. I love what Blackmore and John Lord were doing at the time together. It was just, they were at the time the ultimate jam band. You know, just
the ultimate rock band.
yeah, and you know, I'll end the conversation on this. You know, I tell you, my top three, I think, Pink Floyd albums would have to be obviously Dark Side of the Moon we've been discussing, next For Wall, and then I say finally would be Momentary Lapse of Reason. That's the album they put out in 1987. They had kind of their big comeback. They hadn't toured since The Wall because Roger Waters had left. A lot of people were kind of questioning, can Pink Floyd carry on without Roger Waters? And what we soon found out is because Gilmour was a gifted enough frontman, he was able to do it. And I don't know that Pink Floyd would have been the same if Roger Waters would have carried on without Gilmour. We'll never know, but you know, that was Momentary Lapse of Reason. That was Pink Floyd's kind of last great hurrah, I think. You know.
Well, you know, and that, you know, it got a lot of airplay because there was some great music that came out of that.
Yeah. And they started touring all over the world again. Now, Gar, I want to thank you so much for taking time to do this. Just like last week, I had so much fun doing this. Maybe we'll do it again, but I think obviously we can hear the influence that Pink Floyd and Dark Side of the Moon had on you, because that's pretty much what we talked about. And I think that's really cool. I mean, we found out how much of an influence Yes was on you. So maybe we'll do it again down the line, but thanks for doing this.